Okay, I thought I'd like to start with asking a bit about the background of the book, how this came together, how you came to co-author this book. So I guess I'll throw that out to both of the authors. Maybe.
Let me start with that. Yeah. We had been working together on various projects for a long time and been thinking about writing such a book. And then finally in the COVID year, 2021, we said, we have time, let's get started. It's sort of interesting how modern technology allows us to sort of compare our notes and draft chapters. We sort of distributed the work in the sense that we said one drafts this chapter, the other one drafts the other chapter. And then we exchanged it on Google Docs, and there was additions made from both sides. So in other words, technology made it quite easy to do a book over such a long distance. Peter, you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe another aspect. Actually, Günter, as you know, is working in US archives on the topic of Austria and the Cold War already, I think, for more than 4 decades. Me personally, I was working, have to say, until the pandemic began in Russian archives since the end of the 90s, so more than 20 years. And as Günter said, we were working together on several projects on Cold War issues like the Prague Spring in 1968, or on the détente, or on the occupation era. So we almost covered the whole Cold War on the basis of different research projects where we really, over the last 2 decades, were working in Soviet, respectively American and other archives for more than 2 decades. And we both have written and published, I think, in dozens of scientific essays on all these various topics. And already many years ago said we should once summarize all our findings and just in the book, yeah, since mostly we were asked by students. I mean, students we know want to easily get an overview on the main issues. And if you just teach, for example, Cold War in Austria, you have to scan dozens of books and essays just to get a first survey on the status of research. And this was mainly the task of our book, and what we intended to do with we. At the end of every chapter, for example, we just listed up the main research literature on various topics, just to also to give a possibility for mainly students to get a first in-depth overview on the status of research. And I can add, the book was published in June, and I just got the message that the first edition is almost sold out, that the Lycan publishers thinking about reprinting the book already, which is, I mean, for Austria, it's very much, it's 750 books. For America, it's not that much, but for a German written book, it's quite a lot. And just the reactions, especially in the media, were completely astonishing, not that much astonishing on the basis of what is happening in the Ukraine, and I mean neutrality issues and so on have become immediately and extremely just interesting to the public, to the medias. And we both, Günter and me, gave dozens of interviews to Austrian journalists, and our book was really mentioned in all newspapers. We were on television, and so was unfortunately a war had to begin in order to attract the book so much to the public.
I think we can also add, Mark, that we are planning for an English edition. We are looking for a publisher. we've been working on a translation, so that will come next.
That's good. I had a student in class ask if there would be an English edition, so it's good to hear you're working on that, and congrats on the brisk sales. I'm going to start. Oh, sorry, Peter. Do you want to add something, or?
At least there are many, of course, English essays on various topics available. And for example, if you also want to use it at New Orleans University, you can just really go through the lists of publications, listed up by the various chapters, and you'll find a lot of English literature there as well.
Okay. Well, I think I'll start with a few questions that get at some of the main topics and themes that you worked on. Günter, an early, obviously important development in the Cold War was the Marshall Plan. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Marshall Plan in Austria, how it came about, and what its impact was.
Yeah, that's an important question. I think as probably most people know, Central Europe, Austria too, since it was part of the Third Reich, was much destroyed at the end of the war, not only by the action in the field, but also by the Allied bombing. So in order to get the country back on its feet, the Americans decided, once the Marshall Plan was announced, they would include it amongst the 16 countries that received Marshall Plan aid. And in fact, Austria received a very inordinate amount of Marshall Plan aid, about $1 billion altogether, which was the third highest per capita rate of Marshall Plan aid. So the Marshall Plan helped not only to rebuild industry, but also to rebuild agriculture, tourism, all the important sectors of the Austrian economy. And of course, since this was an American initiative, as you would expect, remember the Marshall Plan was announced 47, started 48, and this was right at the time when the Cold War broke out. So there was a massive campaign by Stalin and the Soviets against the Marshall Plan, calling it American imperialism in Europe. So that became part of the background Cold War noise on the Marshall Plan. So the legacy of the Marshall Plan, of course, is that Austria profited enormously from it, not only the direct Marshall Plan aid, but also the so-called ERP fund. This was money generated through the Marshall Plan, the so-called ERP counterpart funds, collected in a fund, then given to the Austrian government, which is still being invested today in the Austrian economy. This is essentially a leftover fund from Marshall Plan money generated that's still very much at work in Austria. So the point is, the Marshall Plan still is at work in Austria. So it has a long time legacy.
Thank you. Peter, you just, when you were speaking at the beginning, you mentioned with the war in the Ukraine that things like Austrian neutrality and the state treaty have been discussed more in the media. And we've seen in the United States, even people have been talking about, prior to the run-up to the war, maybe having an Austrian solution for Ukraine in terms of trying to avert the war. But clearly there's renewed interest in these developments in Austria. So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about how the Austrian state treaty came about, and the development of Austrian neutrality as well?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, of course, but let me just briefly explain the differences, or maybe the ontologies of the emergence of the Austrian neutrality. When Khrushchev took over more or less in the Kremlin, he had a very clear idea how to solve the Austrian question. He was mainly driven by the idea that one has to leave Austria, one has to took out Soviet troops out of the country by various reasons. Yeah, but also at that time, 1953-4, it was not that clear in the Kremlin what a neutrality would look like and what this would mean, mainly for security reasons for the Soviet Union. On the other hand, Molotov and others warned that neutrality would not, as Khrushchev expected, be a fertile ground for spreading socialism in Central Europe and elsewhere. But he more feared that the model of neutrality would be undermine the Eastern Bloc. He was right, more or less, a year after the conclusion of the Austrian State Treaty in Hungary in 1956, Hungarian uprising and so on, the declaration of Hungarian neutrality, also Austria as a model for this. It was a struggle of power in the Kremlin behind this, but anyway, Khrushchev succeeded with his way. Another component, still not under-researched, one has to say, the economics aspects. Yeah, Khrushchev was very much supported by Anastas Mikoyan, who clearly said that the Soviet occupation of Eastern Austria became a financial burden for the Soviet Union. Oil has been exploited, and so it was also a financial question, but of course, as we know, political reasons in this case were more important. So Austrian neutrality was, of course, a compromise in the early détente. Also, Khrushchev wanted to give with this, of course, a clear signal to the West, although West at the beginning did not really trust Khrushchev and so on, but at the end, it succeeded. Yeah, it succeeded. All the Allied powers agreed to leave Austria and to give Austria back its full sovereignty. What neutrality meant for Austria itself was, of course, is a totally different history. That the neutrality became more or less a question of identity. So we could talk about this for hours, of course, but since you asked me about the situation today, it's of course, I mean, no one knows, but under Putin, I don't see any chances for a neutral solution for the Ukraine. At the beginning of the invasion, it would have been an option if Putin really wanted to achieve only, for example, a declaration of Ukraine that Ukraine really will not join NATO anytime, but actually the facts show the opposite, that the aims are totally different. And at the moment, what would neutrality mean for the Ukraine today? I mean, that's more or less a half joining of NATO, but because someone has to guarantee neutrality. Yeah, someone has to guarantee statehood, as in the case of Austria. I mean, on the one hand, Austrian neutrality was exposed from the outside. Yeah. On the other hand, neutrality then back in 1955 was something Austrian politicians were ready to pay the price. Today it sounds quite ridiculous even, or funny, that this was a price Austrians then were ready to pay. Today the situation is totally different and no one wants to give up neutrality, although Austria in fact is not really neutral anymore and is not in a position to be neutral. And more or less, as seen from the perspective of today, Austria today has more or less achieved its long-term goals, yeah, in ending up in the West and in the Western camp completely. Yeah, today it is under question, more or less, yeah, the total integration into West, into European market and so on, by quite a, even not majority, but up to 50% of the population, yeah, who are against the strict course of Austrian government today. So briefly to say the evaluation of the development of Austrian neutrality that would deserve an extra talk here, and but is still not only a matter of Austrian politics and Central European security politics, but matters, of course, today's world politics at all.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we'll come back to this in the Q&A. I'm sure there's more interest in that. Günter, we know that the Cold War, we often learn and read about this as high politics and geopolitics, but you pay some attention to culture, quite a bit of attention in this book. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about the cultural Cold War in Austria.
Yeah, Peter already mentioned Austria ended up in the Western camp after 55. And one of the reasons one could argue that Austria ended up in the Western camp was the strong American cultural presence. So indeed, the cultural Cold War is a relatively new topic. For a long time, the Cold War has been researched in terms of politics, economics, social history, but not in terms of culture. But the past 20 years, culture has become important, and that's true for Austria too. In fact, a colleague in Austria, Reinhold Wagenleitner, was a pioneer of the cultural approach to the Cold War 30 years ago already. In the 1990s, he penned a book on the Coca-Colonization of Austria. And of course, that was a source that was very important for this chapter. I mean, try to imagine Austria was under four-power control for the first 10 years, post-war years of its existence, in all four occupation powers, the British, the French, the Americans, the Soviets, wanted to sort of put a cultural imprint on Austria. And that meant, the Soviets brought a lot of orchestras, and music was important to them. So it was to the French, the British, and the Americans tried to influence the country in the long term also by bringing its language and its education system to Austria as part of the democratization of the country. But clearly the Americans had the largest impact with their various Americanization policies. And that had a lot to do with the fact that they had the most money to spend in cultural programs too. And that made a big difference in terms of their influence in Austria. So not only were they big in bringing popular culture to Austria, which is to say things that were really popular with young people, like films and through America houses, education and magazines, and but also, of course, popular consumer products. So when we think of Americanization, it's not only culture and popular culture, but also American consumerism that came to Austria and to other parts of Europe and the world. And that meant particularly, you could say, Coca-Cola, jeans, and chewing gum, that came with occupation soldiers. All of the above. But at the same time, the Americans wanted to show that they had quote unquote high culture too. And they would bring, George Gershwin and American theater, Thornton Wilder and so forth to the Austrian stage. So it was a pretty broad approach, but they also had an institution that they invested a lot in called America houses. That was in all the big and many of the smaller cities of the American zone, that the American cultural presence would be particularly strong. And if you think of Austria prior to the occupation period, during the Nazi period, people didn't really have access to literature and so forth. So to have a heated room, an America library, where books and magazines and newspapers and records were available, that was a very big offer to the general community. And I think that's the reason, particularly the younger generation embraced American culture. That's an important aspect of Wagenleitner's work, that he shows how the young generation embraced the work. The older generation, remember, they might be infested with Nazi ideas or had supported the Nazi regime. And they often were looking down upon American culture. They thought Americans were uncivilized and uncultured. And there it didn't make as big of an inroad as with the young people. So I would say the cultural Cold War was fought very vigorously, particularly during the occupation time, into the post-war, post-occupation period as well. But the Americans came out ahead there.
So it sounds like quite a bit of soft power was employed in Austria as well.
Yeah.
Peter, it's in the title of your book, Austria and the Cold War, a balancing act between the East and West. So this is also a central theme, is Austria somehow trying to find a role between these two blocks. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Austria played that role as a mediator between East and West.
Actually, Austrian politicians tried already at the very early stage to mediate in Cold War crisis, beginning with the Berlin crisis at the end of the 50s. This was mainly on the background of the success of achieving the state treaty in Moscow. Austrian politicians, mainly Chancellor Raab, then the later Foreign Minister Kreisky, did have good channels to Moscow. They knew and everyone from the negotiation talks and so on, but also the Austrian ambassador, then Ambassador Norbert Bischof, who just cultivated somehow kind of a channel policy. At the very early stage, they were still quite naive in thinking that they could play a major role in negotiating between the US then and Khrushchev. Khrushchev at that time mainly used the Austrian politicians to underline his strong will in, for example, during the Berlin crisis, to really took over West Berlin and so on. This brought the Austrians, mainly then Bruno Kreisky, in quite situation in being, downgraded by the international press and so on. But they, the good thing is they never gave up. They used their contacts whenever they could. Even at the later stage, even by extremely, or the Americans itself asked often Austrian politicians to somehow investigate or build bridges and to use the diplomatic channels they had. At that time, it were very little countries who did have quite a good relations to the Soviets. It was the Austrians were at the early stage in a better role than the Finns, for example, but then later also together with the Finns, they achieved quite good, even success. If you just want to mention the Helsinki proceedings, the way to Helsinki, Austrians, the Finns, and later also the Swedes played an extremely important role. And now we see that clearly from the files that this is not only something Austrians itself also always declared that as their achievements. We see that really from the files. How important the neutrals were in this process, and how important this role of mediators between the two camps just was. And so also on this topic we could talk extremely long. There are many cases. Just to give you one more example, for example, the Iron Curtain. Austria, as you know, was mostly surrounded more than 1,000 kilometers of Iron Curtain to the neighboring Eastern European countries. In the 60s, the Hungarian Iron Curtain was quite dangerous, not only for them who tried to escape from Hungary to Austria, but also for Austrians itself. During floodings, for example, mines just came across the border, and even Austrian children were injured at that time. And then the Austrians just told the Hungarians, stop this immediately, or we are just not in a position to do, they don't any longer with you. And the Hungarians did so. So this was a kind also of soft power the Austrians had at that time, as one of the really not many countries who first of all had contact with the countries. We were talking about the time where still a Hallstein doctrine was in power, how to say. So it was, from this point of view, an important player, although it is always something like, how to say, dangerous, of course, to have so close and sometimes even good relations with dictatorships. I mean, we are talking about the communist regime in Hungary just a few years after the crackdown of the Hungarian uprising. But this shows us also that it is important to have kind of any kind or sort of countries who anyway have to keep up the dialogue even with tyrannic systems in order just to achieve, at least in the humanitarian perspective, concrete success in the field of human rights.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question or two more, and then I'm going to open it up to the Q&A. But related to what you've been talking about, Peter, is something I think, at least in popular knowledge, people in the United States associate with Austria in the Cold War, and it's related to this idea of being in between East and West. And this is the notion that Austria was sort of a playground for the different intelligence services on the Cold War sides. And so, Günter, I was wondering if you could illuminate for us, how true is this notion? How much did this reflect reality, that Austria was a place where spy games were rampant?
I think it was particularly true for the occupation period, when all four powers established pretty large contingents of intelligence there. And this means not only civilian agencies, but remember, since occupation also means a military presence, there was a lot of military agencies there too. So if you think about the United States, of course, foremost would be the OSS coming out of World War II, but then also the CIA. And you're talking now not dozens of people, but probably hundreds of people that worked for the CIA. And that also means not only American agents, and this is true for the other intelligence services too, the French Deuxième Bureau, the British intelligence agencies, the Soviets, they all sort of hired Austrian hands who would help them spy on the others. And of course, those Austrian hands wanted to make a little extra money. But of course, in the process, they got pulled ever more deeply into the spying game. And so, for example, the Soviets were sort of in the early Cold War, you could say, pretty shameless, and then taking people off the streets and bringing them to the Soviet Union, incarcerating them, throwing them into jail for many years. Sometimes prominent people like an economics ministry lady by the name of Oettlinger, who they kept for 10 years. So this could be for people a pretty dangerous game too, in that sense, to have, say, contacts with the Americans in the occupation period. But of course, this sort of quieted down a bit after the state treaty was signed after 55, the occupation ended. However, in many respects, it continued. The Americans, for example, kept a considerable presence in the Vienna area because they used it to sort of spy not only on the Soviets, but on all their occupied territory of Eastern Europe across the Iron Curtain with electronic means from Vienna. So the image that is being purveyed in popular culture, say, by movies like The Third Man, which of course is a Cold War classic movie, and I always try to show it in class. That image is quite true, that, you know, Vienna was a bleak place during the occupation period. However, it had this strong presence of foreign intelligence services. I read a document, I found a document once in the American archives where an American diplomat reported back to Washington that in Salzburg, which was sort of the headquarters of the American army during the occupation time, 10% of the population were engaged in working for one intelligence service or another. If you think about it, 10%, that's Salzburg is a mid-sized city. That would be a lot of people, thousands of people working for intelligence services. And of course, that meant in the post-occupation period, probably many of them would be missing that extra income that they got through this means of helping the intelligence services. Again, a lot more can be said. Let me just maybe add something to what Peter said before, speaking of Vienna as a spy capital. Vienna, after the state treaty was signed, also became a place of diplomatic mediation in the Cold War. And many important summit events in the Cold War actually took place in Vienna. If you think of the Kennedy-Khrushchev summit in 1961, of the Carter-Brezhnev summit in 1979. And maybe that's why I wanted to mention it, because if you recently followed the news, the International Atomic Energy Commission sent an investigation team to Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, and this team came out of Vienna. So you sort of ask, why is the IAEA in Vienna? Well, that was sort of a Cold War compromise going back to the mid-1950s, right after the solution of the state treaty and the end of the occupation, that the UN agency moved to Vienna and has been there ever since and has a huge staff in Vienna. In other words, Vienna became, as is often stressed, the third center of the United Nations, next to New York and Geneva, and the presence of the IAEA is one sign of that.
Well, thank you. I'm going to have one more question for Peter, and then I think we can move for a little bit of Q&A. And I'll just say, if anybody wants to put questions into the chat, you can do that, or afterwards you can just speak. But Peter, the moving sort of a little bit ahead in the Cold War, thinking about the high point of détente, this was the Conference for Security and Cooperation. And Austria played a role in the negotiations for the Helsinki Agreement of 1975. And I'm wondering if you could expand on a little bit of how Austria was involved there.
I mean, yeah, most important, I have said before on that already. Maybe let me just stress out that it was an extremely important task for Austrian diplomacy at that time to move ahead with the so-called Basket 3, human rights. Many formulations go back to Austrian diplomats, which found their way then into the declaration. This is kind of DNA of Austrian policy, which, yeah, I would say is still popular until today, though the situation has changed, of course, dramatically. It is an important point from, yeah, as you know, also the Helsinki committees afterwards and so on came up in the Soviet Union and had at least a legal basis to act also in Eastern European countries. Although, as I always say, it is often overstressed, the importance of all these yeah, movements in the Soviet Union. They did play a role, of course, in the breakup of the Soviet Union then and the beginning of the 80s, but it was to a lesser extent, of course, their role. But it was a kind of changing Soviet society, but it would be too much to overemphasize the impact of the Helsinki agreements to what has happened 15 years later when the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended, of course, mainly, I mean, especially since Mikhail Gorbachev has been has died, has passed away a few days ago. Much has been said in the last week on that. From the Austrian perspective, I can say a few words on the opening of the Iron Curtain for Austria. This meant, of course, Austria was, although ideologically ended up already in the Western camp at the with the signing of the Austrian State Treaty and with the more or less treatment of Austrian neutrality in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But economically, Austria ended up in the European Union only after the Cold War, because the Soviet Union always protested in any Austrian move towards Brussels or economic. I mean, Austria was, of course, a member of the EFTA, of the smaller group of mainly with the Scandinavian countries, but was not allowed to enter the then Europäische Gemeinschaft, the Wirtschaftsgemeinschaft, the European Economic Community, because Moscow was vetoing Austria's position, of course. Yeah, mainly by the main reason, because Austria was not allowed to enter to any economic or how the Soviet treated it, political communities or unions where Germany is taking part. One of the main reasons and for one of the main aim of Soviet policy always was to separate Austria from Germany consequently and forever. And so from the economic point of view, at the end of the Cold War, Austria just brought benefits. Yeah, I mean, Austrian politicians always stressed that Eastern Europe was Austria's China in the 90s and later on. So yeah, just one word on also on that. Then the opening of the Iron Curtain. I mean, Austria ended up in the middle of nowhere. If you just see, for example, 30 years ago, we still do not have a highway between Prague and Vienna, for example. Yeah? It's somewhere still in the minds. It's of course it's somehow disappearing. Yeah, but it took at least more than a decade to realize that Austria is not more at the end of the world. Yeah, that the world ends somewhere. But the Iron Curtain was opened mainly by the reforms of the Hungarian reform communists. And yeah, there are also some interesting stories in this book on the opening of the Iron Curtain. Some things were not really that planned as we maybe think today. Just happened by accident. And so really interesting story on 1989, the process which then on 9th of November 1989 ended in Berlin with the fall of the Berlin Wall.
All right, thank you. I think I would have some more questions, but I think I want to open it up to some audience participation at this point. So I'll ask if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, they can unmute themselves and feel free. Raise your hand and I can. Yes, Devin, sweet.
Hi, my name is Devin. I'm a grad student here at UNO. As we know, there's a lot of concern in Europe right now about Russia possibly expanding its goals to include some of the rest of Europe. Right now, one of the pretexts is that it's using to invade Ukraine is the claims of a lot of Nazism in Ukraine. Could that be seen as some sort of concern in Austria, given its implicit role in the Third Reich? Is that something that people in Austria are having discussions about in this time of troubles that we're in?
Peter, you want to give it a stab?
Yeah, I did not quite understand what you mean. Could you just briefly, or Günter?
Yeah, I think he sort of thinks, is there any thinking in Austria on possible repercussions of the Russian presence in Ukraine, that one day it could threaten Austria too. Is that what you meant,
Okay.
Devin?
Yes.
Yeah.
No. To a
Since
lesser
I don't live
extent,
there,
this-
I'll let Peter answer that
This,
question.
this does not play any role. I think it's even the opposite is the case. Austria is among the countries where, yeah, if you ask the people, up to 50% are against the sanctions against Russia. Yeah, or as seen from the Russian perspective, Russia did quite a good job in the last 3 decades. Yeah, in building up good ties to Austria, not only officially, but also, to maybe, to promote Russian culture and so on. There is, unfortunately, a deep understanding for, I would say, for Putinism, and with this, with today's Russia. It's to a lesser extent fears or something which we know from 1956 or 1968, the Russians will come back. The fears which do play a crucial role, of course, in the Baltic states today and in Poland and in Czech Republic, Slovakia, and other Eastern European countries, not Hungary, with the exception, but also not in Austria. So it's the official position is very clear. Bundeskanzler Nehammer took a very clear stance from the beginning on, claiming, don't have to repeat the official position, but hardly anyone, or really the majority, does not really believe or can imagine that Ukrainians are really fighting for freedom of Europe there. So, or with other words, there are many people thinking, just stop the war and we can keep on doing business as it was.
Maybe let me add, Peter, it's important to understand for Americans, Devin, that this is where Austrian neutrality comes in. Austria is not part of NATO. And whenever there is a threat of spillover of Putin's war in Ukraine to other European countries, we think of the Baltic states, we think of Poland, but we don't. We think of NATO states, but we don't necessarily think of neutral Austria, which, as Peter stresses, has built, if you will, a special relationship even with Putin's Russia, which they hope will help in this situation.
Yeah, actually, this is the thinking of the Insel der Seligen. I don't know how to say in English. Yeah,
the island of the blessed.
We also write about this in the book. Yeah, the feeling of Austria, for example, if, for example, the atomic fear or the fear of atomic attacks, led up to psychological problems throughout Western Europe. As we know from studies. In Austria, this didn't play a role at all. Austrian thinking, we're living on something on an island. No one can harm us. No one will attack us. Why should anyone attack us? So this is also not also among the population not seen as a security issue, but something like it's deeply inside there, or how some politicians said, the hearts of the Austrians. Not only in the hearts, but really in the brains, believing that no atomic bomb ever will come down on Austria. Even if it comes down somewhere else, it will not harm us. So I'm now a little bit overemphasizing this, but this brings it more or less to the point how the majority of Austrians feel. So, and also, and not understanding what is really going on, that the fear is real, and what this would mean for Europe if Putin's Russia, I don't say Russia in this case, if Putin's Russia really would succeed in even taking control over whole Ukraine. So this is something far away from Austrian minds. Not from, I'm not talking about the official Austrian policy, which is of course very clear and in the line with the European Union.
Well, Peter, if you speak of nuclear fear, you know, here on American television, every day we hear about Zaporizhia, the power plant. And of course, if there is an accident there, or if it should be shelled by the Russians, or as the Russians say, by the Ukrainians, which I doubt, if there is a nuclear incident there, the Austrians, of course, would feel it much more quickly than most people would. Is that a discussion?
It did go in 1986. I mean, Chernobyl, yeah. I mean, we still do not know how many victims really. I mean, it's hard to see, but I saw some studies, yeah, going back. So how many cases on cancer really go back to the incident in 1986? Yeah, I mean, I was 10 years old then at the time. I mean, we all remember this, what this meant. We were not allowed to go outside, not allowed to eat or to use our gardens. Yeah, I mean, this was, I think, for 1 year, and then later on it was said it's all okay. Until nowadays, authorities are, I think, yeah, I'm not a specialist in this field. We are a little bit writing. We do touch the topic, but Chernobyl is still a topic, especially in the region of Styria, Carinthia. Yeah, when you go, how is it, Schwammerl suchen? Yeah, Günter, hilf mir kurz. Cäsiumwerte sind teilweise bis heute sehr hoch und es wird abgeraten, in gewissen Regionen zu suchen. Andererseits heißt es, man soll keine Sorge haben.
So if you go look for mushrooms, you know, there is still very high incidence of this substance cesium in them. If you go in Carinthia, where Peter lives, and no, in Styria, where he lives, and in Carinthia. So in that sense, Chernobyl is still very present. So my point is, one would think Zaporizhia and the danger of it would be very present in Austria too. But we want to open it up to questions, huh, Mark?
Sure, yeah, and you know, you touched on something else that you know, with nuclear power, Austria has sort of a special relationship to nuclear power. So if there aren't any questions about that, I might ask one. But I saw Chris Jackson. I think you had unmuted yourself, and then I also in the chat have a question from Elvis Ingersoll. So maybe Chris, you could go first, and then I'll get to Elvis's question.
Sure, I'd like to go back just a little bit,
Sure.
and in particular, look at the contrast between West Germany and Austria. And simply put, why is there a Stalin note in '52 that is rejected, the idea of neutrality for West Germany or all of Germany, and yet it seems to sail through in '55 for Austria? What's the difference between the two?
Peter, you want to give it a try? Since you wrote a book on the Stalin notes, yeah.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research on the Stalin Note 1952 and also on the Austrian neutrality, of course. Just very briefly, it's a totally different story. We did summarize this in our book on a few sites. So, first of all, Stalin's offer was not an offer and it was not serious. Stalin did want to achieve the opposite, the deepening of the German division. Neutrality, at least for Stalin, was never an option. I could talk really hours about it, and I can offer you to send you some in-depth essays also published in English on that. I published one in the Cold War, as a Journal of Cold War Studies, for example, summarizing this. I was working in the Soviet archives for many years, especially on these topics, and did find the holdings of the Politburo and Molotov all on this 1952 issue. It was also not an option in 1955. For example, German Kurt Schumacher, SPD, did ask the Austrians, so to say, to speak with Khrushchev about the possibility of solution of neutrality also for Germany. Behind the scenes, the Austrians were told very strictly that I don't recall it now how it was said in, but mainly like this: if we would give Germany neutrality, and Germany would say from one day to another, we give up neutrality, what should we do then? Should we begin a war against Germany? So it is a huge difference to allow, from the Soviet perspective, a small country neutral option, but not for a big nation as Germany. So 1952, it was mainly a tactical issue with the main goal, in deepening the German division and in setting up or how to say in English, to strengthen the East German communist state, and to deepen with this also the Eastern Bloc. But it was never an option for Stalin to give up its position in Germany.
Maybe let me add something. First of all, hey to my college roommate, Chris Jackson in California. Good to see you, Chris. I think an important point also is that the Western powers never would have tolerated a neutralization of Germany. However, they would allow it with regard to Austria, even though they were sort of concerned when the Austrians went to Moscow to negotiate it in the spring of 1955. So I think the position of the Western powers had something to do with it too. And of course, there was also Adenauer, who himself didn't want neutralization. And when the Austrians negotiated it, he called the whole business diese ganze österreichische Schweinerei, this Austrian pigsty, so to speak. So he didn't like at all what happened in Austria in 55, because he was probably afraid, well, he's showing too many Germans can be done,
Yeah, not that much that he didn't like the idea, but he clearly understood what this would mean for Western Germany. Yeah, and mainly it was a tactical measure, as I said, but not only for tactical reasons. I mean, the success for Soviet propaganda was enormous in Western Germany. Yeah, many people really believing that this is a historical chance, and it is Adenauer who is saying no to that. But he very clearly understood, of course, that this would lead to nowhere, and that the main goal of Soviet propaganda is, more or less, you can see some parallels to today's Putin's foreign policy, to split the Western camp. Yeah, because also in the West it was, of course, not really that much clear in 1952, where they how the division of Europe would look like a few years later. But the question came back in 1990. A neutral option for Germany was very much discussed behind the scenes. It was mainly also Genscher more or less pursuing this idea, not in the words of neutrality, but at least as a bloc-free country and so on. It was at least tried from some Soviet diplomats to achieve, if Germany would be reunified, then at least as a bloc-free country, and not joining, or more or less Germany leaving NATO. It was Douglas Hurt and saying to the Soviets, even with a smile in Ottawa in 1990, but shouldn't you agree, he meant the Soviets, and be happy about a situation that Germany is part of NATO and not between the blocs, because outside of NATO, Germany may become a danger for the Soviet Union again. So, ironically, more or less used the argument against the Soviet Union at that time. And another aspect why it came back to 1952. More or less the Soviet policy in 1990 regarding towards German reunification became the victim of its own propaganda from 1952. On the other hand, Soviet population was more or less prepared. It was the propaganda throughout the whole Cold War. We, the Soviet Union, we always were for German reunification. It helped on the one side Gorbachev explaining he did not have to explain a lot in 1990 why Germany now reunifies. I mean, this was also always more or less on the agenda of Soviet policy, which was of course not, but on the agenda of Soviet propaganda. So it helped Gorbachev on the one side, and on the other side, with this, Soviet foreign policy became the victim of its own propaganda 40 years before.
Okay.
Yeah, we have published a lot of files on that and documents in Russian and German, and some even in Russian. It was always for the research projects which Günter was talking about, published a lot together with the Russian archives, and for example on the German reunification, a special volume came out in 2014 in German and in Russian.
Yeah,
So
Mark, do we have one more question?
we had one more question. You know, we're coming up on an hour, and I would like to keep it to an hour. But I'll read the question, and maybe you could, if you have some brief thoughts about it. This was from Elvis Ingersoll, and he asked, "Are there any major parallels that you see between Austria and Ukraine in the ways that the two countries have been influenced by the West and Russia?" So parallels between Austria and Ukraine in that both of them had Western and Russian influences. Do you see parallels?
I don't really, yeah, no, I don't really see many parallels there. You know, the situations are so different. Well, I mean, if you will, the Ukrainians, I think, would like to have more Western influence. And of course, many Ukrainians would like to be part of NATO. So maybe in that sense, but that's definitely not the case, as Peter already stressed, in Austria. So I don't see a lot of parallels there.
Mm-hmm. I just see that my colleague and friend Oleksiy Yakhno from the Ukraine is taking part here. Oh, he just left. No, he's here. We can organize a separate talk on that with you if you want. He's a political scientist from the Ukraine who managed to escape the hell of Bucha. He was living there for 3 years and is now in Austria. So this question would deserve, I think, an extra talk and should be answered really by a specialist and not by one of us in this case.
We can think about that, yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case, you know, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. And Senator Austria will be having a talk next week on the Habsburg monarchy and the American Revolution. For those of you that are interested, look at your emails. But I also want to say thank you to the authors, to Günter and Peter, and congratulations on the book, and really appreciate the interesting discussion.
And thank you everybody for tuning in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Peter.